It is never business as usual in the relations of the Russian Federation and the United States of America. We are the two most heavily armed nuclear-tipped nations in the world. We have to find a way. In all the stressors and all the difficulties, and goodness knows, from our perspective, they've committed a lot of transgressions, especially recently. We have to find conduits to identify those areas where we have the most distrust, work on those, but also look for convergences amongst the mud of divergences, and try to find a way toward at least a more credible, not dangerous relationship.
Does Russia need to be an ally when it comes to combating ISIS, or?
We have to find a way to be partners. Ideally, we could be allies. We were allies once, if you remember, in the Second World War. They called it the Great Patriotic War. We've got to at least find a partnership for this fight, aspire to something better. The alternative is potentially, if we are adversaries, if you will, in an environment where we have the same foe but different interests, you could end up in a very, very dangerous situation that involves an incident or an accident that creates, because of the distrust and lack of communication, though there are some modest conduits now, we could land ourselves in a very, very dangerous situation. And neither of us ever want to get into a situation that involves brinksmanship.
Recently there was a shoot down and close passes with aircraft and Navy ships. How dangerous are those occurrences when they happen?
Those are always dangerous. There's a lot of metal, both flying and sailing, and if you will, moving underwater. Have to talk to each other, especially when we have these periods of high tension. Because if something happens today, it could be cyber fast. And we need to be sure that we have the deconfliction mechanisms out there to kind of talk each other off the ledge, especially if it was an accident or incident. There are some modest things that have been rebuilt, but overall worldwide, our conduits are drastically, drastically atrophied. We had more linkages and contacts during the darkest days of the Cold War than we do now. It's a little better now. We have a long way to go, and there's an awful lot of stuff flying out there, and accidents are possible. In an automated world, and things are fast, and you're not sure what the other person is, and if you have, when I talk about contours, it doesn't mean we agree on everything, but maybe you have an understanding on something. You might understand where the other side's coming from. Doesn't mean they're right from our perspective, or they're right, but you need that today, and we just need to keep working at it. There's no alternative but trying to find a way, protect our allies, reassure them, our partners, push back on transgressions. That's one track on a dual track policy. On the second track, you try to, where never giving up your own principles, find conduits and linkages of common interest.
Did you ever get to meet with Putin in person?
No, I saw him a couple of times, but I was with a group in Kaliningrad for what they call Zapad, Western Exercise 2013, and we're on the 4-year anniversary now. It was in Kaliningrad, and all of us attachés were watching the Russians storm in on the beach from the Baltic Sea. With their landing ships and aircraft and almost the most monstrous hovercraft you would ever see, and it was quite a show, ostensibly to fight back a terrorist threat, but really in our mind it was to message the region, to include the Poles and the Balts and NATO, that we're here and don't mess with us, and we're here. At the end of it, we're all thronged down there, and Putin looks down and says something along the line of, "Good to see you." and then walks off and whisked away in his motorcade. He is an Uber leader. He's an alpha leader, alpha decision maker. He makes the decisions in that country. He does listen to some advice, I believe. He is hands-on, both in the political and economic side, but also in the military. I am stating what I think. I've not seen the meetings or anything like that. This is a man clearly in charge. That 85% that you read about of support for Putin, in my mind, doesn't necessarily mean support for the Russian regime. And I think that always within the signs of muscularity and power, there's an inherent ingrained insecurity based on Russia's history, based on the nature of this kleptocratic regime. There are talks of corruption. You had Russian youth in the streets lately, which kind of hadn't seen that since 2012. So Putin is also a balancer. But I will say this, I think that we all, including myself, underestimated him in that he has been in and around power, direct power, for 17, close to 18 years, and no other major consequential statesman in the world can say that. So he is, nobody can say he's not clever and canny, a balancer, clearly sees us as, he sees us as a propagator of regime change. And he sees us as a adversary in many ways. I think in the gray zone, this whole world of hybrid as an enemy. I think the Russians understand that they're in a straight, if you will, conventional conflict, other than the initial phases where they would attain surprise and all of that would be their objective, that they are outmanned and outgunned. So they don't want war. The Russians do not want war. But they think about it far more than we do, and in many ways, psychologically, materially, and societally, preparing for it, for a worst-case scenario. And that's something we always need to be aware of. Again, Russia lives in a world of existential threats. They've had threats throughout their history, all around their periphery. They built a lot of it by themselves. This is an 11 time zone country. Population of 145 million people. 40% of the United States, 1/3 of the European Union, and 1/8 of the People's Republic of China. This vast country. So they have a lot to think about, a lot to worry about. A lot of it brought on by their own actions, but also history. And then finally, this is a country that has really, even as our ally, has endured a lot, has suffered a lot, some of it by its own, whether it is the Second World War, where 20 to 26 million of Russians or Soviets died. You had between 1914 and 1954, nobody knows the number, it will throw out a number, 40 million people, plus or minus 5, that die in the Russian World War I, Russian Revolution, the Civil War, famines, repressions, purges, the Nazis that came out of the West in the most, if you will, horrific modern day threat, war of annihilation, and the Gulag. So it's as if the whole nation, in some way, is coming off the effects of a collective PTSD, in my mind. So they've got a lot to work on. In the long term, there are those of us that would think that Russia's future is somehow a credible relation. I'm not going to say allies or even, but credible relationship with the West. The South doesn't give them much, and China is so overwhelmingly big and economic that they will be, if you will, subsumed by China in the Far East in many ways.
Now, when you speak of Russia being so large, it's geographically large, but you were talking about population-wise, not that big. Is this kind of their last gasp at remaining a global player?
Yeah. If you were to take the Russian Federation, if you look at Russia today as you would at a hospital, patient. If you look out generationally, and the leadership is, they know it, they see it. It's like all the vital signs are negative. Mm-hmm. They have somewhat restored their birth rate now is a little higher than their death rate, but mm-hmm. not by much. The nature of that 144 million population is changing. You have 8% of that population is Islam, mostly secular. Mm-hmm. 90% of that is Sunni or plus. It is Sunnis that they are involved in fighting in Syria mm-hmm. and killing in large numbers. Chechens, Dagestanis are Sunni, so they've got that demographic challenge in the Caucasus in the south. Economy, it is primarily petroleum based. Mm-hmm. It is a very rich country in resources, but those resources aren't finite. Mm-hmm. You have these vast borders that they've got to deal with. We've talked, and then you have this state of confrontation with the West. That in part, the Russians feel that the West is threatening to them. Mm-hmm. They'll go back into their history. Yep. We'll say it's wrong. Mm-hmm. We believe it's wrong. But one has to at least try to, well, not necessarily agreeing, look at the Russian worldview, which is definitely a circle the wagons mentality. And the last point on this mm-hmm. is that in 1991, the day after Christmas, Russia is the greatest of 15 republics that made up the Soviet Union. And in a stroke of a clock, 14 of those 15 republics fall away. Some of those countries are become almost adversaries to Russia. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, the Russian population is almost halved. And 25 million of those Russians now live in other countries, not always comfortably, which are the hot spots, the hot zones that we're seeing right now.
Such as Ukraine.
Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan and the Baltics and Moldova and all the places you read about. So they're balancing all of that. You get at the point they're not that big, that 144 million demographic makes it hard with all the financial challenges they have, because they are being sanctioned, rightfully so, I believe, for their transgression in Ukraine and the illegal annexation of Crimea. But it's hard financially to field a 1 million person active duty military. That's big, but when you put it in the 1 million in the 11 time zone construct, and much of that time zone was carved out of the hides of civilizations and nations of other nations, mm-hmm. it's hard. Yeah. To summarize, I really believe that Russia's future, and we've got to get through this next 3 to 5 years in our mind, is not get into a major confrontation or accident or conflict, God forbid, with the West, NATO. Mm-hmm. Don't challenge Article 5. That would be a terrible mistake on their part, NATO. And then, as I said, because I think the West is their life raft, because the South doesn't give them much. In the Far East, they'll have some trade with China and all that, but they will always be subordinate. And it's bleak and cold out there. So they've got a lot. So the life signs, everything is going down. If you go out in a generational perspective, they see it. They're trying to turn the ship. They're trying to buy time. And they've got to find a way with us. We've got to find a way with us. To close on what we just talked about, the level of distrust is as high or even higher since 2014 in Ukraine. The whole cyber hack business was, caught hand in a cookie jar, way out of line. They create a lot of disruption. But what they managed to do was now get the American body politic left of the aisle and right of the aisle, both now furious at the Russians mm-hmm. for that cyber thing. And that was not their intent, when they started it. So they've got a lot going on. In the end, they're nuclear tipped. It is never business as usual with Russia. We have to work it. They know it. They're a superpower in nuclear, in oil, maybe the fine arts, and that's about it. And they will shake and rattle and get our attention, but the capability is there. So every day we have to work with the Russians and try to bring this level of distrust, develop a layer of understanding that gets, and even if you officially have your talking points that you disagree with, as I said, you get to that level of understanding at the personal level, like you and me right now, and over time, hopefully get to a better result. There might be a grand endeavor out there that we need to work on, and whether it is the Arctic or something in space, something big to get us working together to try to get our populations focused, if you will, on something rather than the tension that we have.
Being on the same team about anything.
Exactly. And we remember Soyuz and Apollo in 1975. Nobody, you had to somehow in that period of intense distrust, the height of the Cold War, 2 years after we were on DEFCON 3 during the Yom Kippur War, Russians, Soviet scientists and American scientists trusted each other enough to make the airlocks fit in Earth orbit, and U.S. astronauts and cosmonauts extend, shake hands out there. That's some construct like that we need to aspire to again.